They thought the screams had done their work. They thought the wires, the blows, the endless nights in a Gestapo cellar had finally broken her. In Berlin, officers signed reports declaring her neutralized. In London, her radio went silent. And across occupied Europe, thousands of lives now hung on the assumption that one woman could no longer speak. If you enjoy deeply human war stories like this, subscribe the channel. In the early 1940s, Nazi-occupied Europe was a continent of whispers. Words were more dangerous than bullets. A sentence overheard in a cafe could mean a firing squad. A wrong knock on the door at night could erase an entire family. And in this shadow world, radio operators were among the most hunted people alive. She was one of them. Young, trained in secrecy, living under false names in borrowed rooms with a suitcase radio that could condemn everyone around her if discovered. Her job was simple to describe and nearly impossible to survive. Transmit intelligence to the Allies from inside the Reich's tightening grip. Every broadcast was a race against time. German direction-finding bands prowled the streets, triangulating signals in minutes. Operators were taught never to transmit longer than 20 seconds. She often risked 30, sometimes more, because what she was sending mattered. Train movements, unit redeployments, new air defenses, signs of something larger forming beneath the surface. By the time the Gestapo closed in, she already knew the danger. Friends had vanished. Safe houses had gone dark. Messages from London carried an edge of urgency she hadn't heard before. German forces were shifting. Quietly, deliberately. Something was coming. Her arrest was swift and brutal. A door smashed in before dawn. Papers scattered across the floor. The radio seized before she could destroy it. The Gestapo officers didn't shout at first. They didn't need to. They knew exactly who she was. What followed was systematic, interrogation rooms designed to feel endless. Sleep deprivation. Pain carefully measured, not to kill, but to break. They wanted her codes, her contacts, the truth behind the transmissions that had already cost the Reich men and machines. And eventually, she gave them what they believed was victory. Under torture, mistakes are inevitable. A hesitation, a half answer, enough for the Gestapo to convince themselves they had cracked her. They announced she would now be used as a tool, forced to transmit under German control, feeding false information back to the Allies. In their minds, the resistance network was finished. But here's what the Gestapo never fully understood. Radio operators lived in patterns, in rhythm, in instinct. And London was listening not just to words, but to the spaces between them. Moments like this changed history. Hit-like. So this story reaches more people. When she was placed back in front of the transmitter, her body barely obeyed her anymore. Hands shaking, vision blurred. A guard stood close enough to smell fear and blood. Every tap of the key was watched. Every pause counted. She began transmitting the message the Germans dictated. Routine, harmless, exactly what London would expect from a compromised line. And then she did something almost invisible. She altered the rhythm. To an untrained ear, nothing sounded wrong, but to the operators in Britain, men and women who had trained with her, who knew her habits, it was unmistakable. A pause too long, a cadence slightly off, the kind of mistake she would never make unless she wanted to be noticed. Embedded inside the message was a warning, not in words but in timing. A silent scream saying, "I am captured, this line is compromised. Act now." Then, before the guards realized what had happened, she pushed further. She transmitted one final burst. Short, risky, unapproved. A fragment of intelligence about an imminent German operation. Troop movements. A date window. Enough to confirm the fears already forming in Allied headquarters. The transmission ended. The radio went dead. For the Gestapo, it was too late to undo. For her, there would be no second chance. Within days, Allied commands adjusted plans. Air missions were rerouted. Resistance cells were warned to scatter. Supply drops were delayed. Entire operations were quietly dismantled before German units could spring their trap. Thousands of lives, air crews, resistance fighters, civilians, were spared because one broken woman found the strength to bend a rhythm. She never lived to see the impact. Her fate followed the familiar, horrifying pattern of occupied Europe. Transport, imprisonment, execution, a name added to a list if recorded at all. But in London, intelligence officers marked the file differently. Not lost, not failed. Warning received. The war would rage on for years. Cities would burn. Leaders would gamble with lives from warm rooms far from the front. And after victory, history would focus on generals, conferences, and maps covered in arrows. Yet the truth is quieter. World War II did not turn only on grand decisions. It turned on moments like this. On a trembling hand over a radio key. On the courage to send one last message when silence would have meant survival. Share the story with someone who thinks World War II outcomes were inevitable. Because they weren't. They were shaped by people the enemy believed they had already broken. The Gestapo filed her case as closed. Another resistance courier eliminated. Another radio silenced. In the brutal accounting of occupation, she was a solved problem, but intelligence work has a long memory. In London, analysts replayed her final transmission again and again. They slowed it down, counted the beats, compared it to earlier recordings. What at first sounded like fatigue soon revealed intent. She hadn't simply slipped. She had spoken in a language only fellow operators would hear. That realization sent a chill through the room, because if she had been captured days earlier than suspected, then every message sent since might be compromised. Entire resistance networks could already be exposed. Every delayed decision now carried the weight of lives already marked. Emergency protocols were activated. Code names were burned. Drop zones abandoned. Couriers rerouted through longer, more dangerous paths. Allied planners quietly canceled operations that, on paper, had looked decisive. In one instance, a planned airborne insertion into occupied territory was halted hours before launch. Pilots were already briefed. Paratroopers already writing letters home. German units had been waiting precisely where the men would have landed. They never came. In another case, a resistance cell preparing sabotage on a rail junction received a warning just in time. They dispersed minutes before German trucks arrived. The Gestapo found empty rooms, cold stoves, and nothing to arrest but silence. This is how history often changes. Not with explosions, but with absences. For German intelligence, the failure was catastrophic and deeply embarrassing. Their belief in total control had blinded them to nuance. They understood pain. They understood fear. What they underestimated was professional loyalty, the bond between operators trained to listen beyond words. The Reich had forced her to speak, but it was the Allies who heard her. As the war dragged on, fragments of her story surfaced in declassified reports. Her real name appeared only once, misspelled. Her final message described clinically, without emotion, no mention of torture, no mention of courage, just results. That omission wasn't accidental. Intelligence services rarely celebrate individuals. They protect methods. They bury stories, especially stories that reveal how close disaster came. But among radio operators, her name lingered, taught quietly in training rooms, passed down as a warning and a promise that even under absolute control, there is still a margin, still a choice. The psychological weight of what she did is difficult to overstate. Under torture, the human brain narrows. Survival becomes instinct. Pain erases abstraction. To think clearly enough to manipulate timing, to remember training, to trust that someone on the other end would notice. That required not just bravery, but extraordinary presence of mind. She didn't act on hope. She acted on discipline. And that may be the most unsettling lesson of all, because her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about World War II. The difference between catastrophe and survival was often measured in seconds, in pauses, in details so small they disappear from history books. Leadership failures mattered. Strategic miscalculations mattered. but so did individuals operating far below the level of command, bearing consequences leaders would never face personally. She had no illusion of victory, no expectation of rescue, only the certainty that silence would kill people she would never meet. After the war, memorials went up, statues of soldiers with rifles, plaques listing divisions and dates. Her contribution didn't fit neatly into stone. She left no battlefield, only a signal. Today, her story survives mostly in archives and whispers among historians, yet its relevance has only grown sharper. In an age obsessed with surveillance, coercion, and control, her final act reminds us that power is never absolute. Systems fail at the margins. Human beings find cracks. The Nazis believed terror could erase resistance. They believed pain could overwrite loyalty. They believed that once a person was physically broken, the war was over for them. They were wrong. She proved that even at the very end, when the body is spent and the future already stolen, choice remains. And sometimes one final choice is enough to change everything. In the decades that followed, historians tried to reconstruct the chain of cause and effect. Which warning canceled which operation? How many lives were saved because one timetable shifted? One order was delayed, one ambush never happened. The numbers were always estimates. Conservative ones, thousands was the word that appeared most often. Yet even that number feels inadequate, because the true impact of her final message wasn't only the lives preserved in that moment, it was the precedent it set inside Allied intelligence. From then on, compromised signals were treated differently. Analysts listened harder. Operators were trained to embed warnings not just in codes, but in behavior. The human element became as important as encryption. Her suffering rewrote doctrine, and on the German side, the failure planted doubt. Gestapo officers grew more paranoid, more violent, less precise. They chased phantoms, arrested the wrong people, burned resources trying to control what could no longer be fully controlled. Repression intensified, but effectiveness quietly declined. This is the paradox of terror. The harder it presses, the more brittle it becomes. There is no surviving photograph of her final days, no courtroom transcript, no dramatic last words recorded for history. That absence is honest. War rarely offers clean endings. What we do have is the echo of a signal, brief, fragile, and enough. When we talk about World War II, it's tempting to frame it as inevitable. Industrial might versus ideology. Empires clashing on a scale too large for individuals to matter. But stories like hers dismantle that illusion. History didn't move in a straight line. It lurched. It hesitated. It waited on moments like this. A woman alone in a room with the radio, surrounded by enemies, choosing to act not for survival, but for strangers she would never meet. That choice didn't win the war, but it bent it. Just enough, and sometimes that is all it takes. Long after the guns fell silent, long after victory parades and rewritten borders, intelligence officers were asked a simple question. How close did we come? The answers were uncomfortable. There were operations that would have ended in disaster, networks that would have been rolled up in days, civilians caught in reprisals planned with chilling precision. The Germans were not guessing, they were waiting. And the only reason their trap failed was because someone they believed broken refused to disappear quietly. What makes her story endure is not that she was fearless, it's that she was afraid and acted anyway. Fear did not vanish in that room. Pain did not fade. The Gestapo did not suddenly become careless. Everything about the situation pointed towards surrender, compliance, survival at any cost. And yet, in the narrowest window imaginable, she chose something else. This is where leadership truly lives in wartime. Not always in rank or authority, but in accountability without recognition, in bearing consequences alone, in decisions made with no applause waiting on the other side. She never knew the faces of the people she saved, never heard their names, never watched them return home after the war. Her legacy was anonymous by design. But anonymity does not mean insignificance. The Nazis believed they had mastered the human mind through fear. They believed resistance could be calculated, predicted, eliminated. What they failed to grasp was the quiet resilience that survives even when everything else is stripped away. Her final message was not defiance in the cinematic sense. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was precise. And precision is what defeated them. When we say that her message saved thousands, we're not talking about destiny or myth. We're talking about schedules changed, orders rescinded, men who lived because they were never sent into a killing zone that had already been prepared for them. We're talking about children who grew up because a raid never happened. Families that survived because a warning arrived just in time. This is the real legacy of resistance. Not revenge, not glory, responsibility. The Nazis thought they had broken her. Instead, she broke the certainty they depended on. And in war, certainty is everything. In the end, her story leaves us with a question that has no comfortable answer. What would you do knowing there is no rescue coming? Knowing that cooperation might buy you time, maybe even life, but silence will cost lives you will never see. History often celebrates those who lived to tell their stories. She did not, and that absence forces us to confront a deeper truth about World War II. Many of its most decisive acts were carried out by people who never survived to be thanked. The Nazis believed domination meant control of the body. They cataloged pain, measured it, applied it with clinical efficiency. But control of the body is not the same as control of choice. She proved that in the smallest, quietest way possible. A pause, a rhythm, a final transmission sent under watchful eyes. That was enough. Today, her name may be unfamiliar, her face unknown, yet her impact ripples outward through time, in intelligence doctrines, in survival stories never connected back to her, in lives lived because disaster never came. World War II was not decided only by generals or armies. It was shaped by individuals who refused to surrender responsibility, even when stripped of power, dignity, and hope. She was one of them, and when the Nazis believed they had finally silenced her, she answered, not with words, but with resolve. That answer saved thousands, and it reminds us, even now, that history is never as inevitable as it seems.